James, first of all, give us an idea of where podcasts have reached. What is their standing now, and what is their reach indeed?
So it's been going on. So podcasting first sort of popped up in the zeitgeist in 2003. That's when they first did their first ever test. Could you download an MP3 file? So we're approaching sort of 20 years now. It's steadily grown over the years. There's sort of years that have had a big sort of a bigger spike of interest. But right now there's 4 million podcasts that are registered on all platforms globally. There's 400 million listeners on a monthly basis, and like you rightly said, they cover everything from true crime to sport, and it is an unregulated place for free speech. And as you mentioned at the beginning, it's enabled sort of bedroom enthusiasts and major broadcasters to compete on an even keel, effectively.
Where is the money in all this? How much of it is monetised, and for whom?
We're looking for it all the time. We're trying to find it. No, we just went over £1 billion or $1 billion in annualised revenue through advertising across podcasts last year.
So it's simply advertising that pops up in your podcast?
Yes, so there would be what they call a pre-roll, a mid-roll or a post-roll, but you've also, what's more popular in podcast land is kind of what they call a sort of an ad read by the sort of the actual presenter themselves. That has a higher weight, and I don't think that's accounted for within those statistics. I think we're actually well over $1 billion, but that's where it kind of is stated to be at the moment.
But some people are doing it without money.
Oh, yeah. The vast majority will be making podcasts for the ability. Like, we work with a lot of clients who don't directly monetize their content, but it's great for expert positioning. They become the thought leader in their space. They'll drive people to a call to action. They'll click through to websites, and consultants and experts will get bookings that way. So you don't have to necessarily monetize. If you're a sort of a smaller scale creator, you don't have to monetize your content up front. You can almost get what they call trickle down revenue on the back end.
Tom, talk to us about the free speech side of this. Where do you stand at the moment? Are you a great advocate of podcasts, believing that they are a bastion of free speech?
I am. I mean, it's something that we at Spiked, we've got 3 podcast shows. It's been increasingly a core part of what we do. And I think part of the reason is because the medium has really suited itself to a new appetite for ideas. I think in many respects, the kind of explosion of podcasts, particularly in our sort of space of politics, of discussion of ideas and so on, it really gives the lie to a lot of assumptions we had about audience tastes for media. You know, a few years ago, everything was supposed to be super short. It had to be, if it was an article, it had to be a listicle. If it was a video, it had to be 45 seconds. And yet we're in a situation where something like, say, Joe Rogan's podcast, probably one of the most popular in the world, and certainly the most popular in this kind of realm of just discussing ideas and so on. These things go on for 3 hours at a time. And I think that's a kind of testament to the fact that there is a huge appetite for ideas which isn't being served elsewhere. And luckily, so far, podcasts, unlike some of the other new media forms in the internet space, have not come under the level of censorship, although there is appetite for that kind of clampdown that we've seen in recent years, I think.
There's been a lot of debate recently about online content that's unsuitable. So Meta has been put under the microscope. In the case of a podcast, Tom, who is responsible for the material?
So as far as I understand it, it's the person who produces the material themselves. It's an interesting one insofar as it's, on the one hand, it's kind of slightly decentralised insofar as you've got all these different podcast services that people can often sign up to for free, which then puts that onto the RSS feeds, which feeds into your iPhone and so on. But there is a kind of problem with the fact that, like any of the other kind of big tech companies, there are kind of choke points. For instance, Apple, when they introduced podcasts onto iTunes in about 2005, ever since then, that's become a kind of key way in which people are receiving their podcasts. So the prospect for someone like one of those companies to be able to clamp down on a particular show if they took against it is there, but at the same time, for whatever reason, it has evaded that kind of focus.
Do we have a problem at the moment with podcasts and hate speech?
Well, there's always going to be a kind of particular examples which are dredged up. Interestingly, I think the focus for it in recent years has been less around that and more around questions of what's termed misinformation. That could be around the pandemic, that could be around issues around election integrity in the US and so on. That's tended to be the particular focus. There has been some appetite, you know, particularly from the White House, basically calling on companies like Spotify, which now host a lot of podcasts, to clamp down. That seems to be where a lot of the focus is and where a lot of the concern is, and I think that could be the sort of thin end of the wedge where podcasts and censorship are going to take place, really.
James, let's talk about their social utility. I mean, for example, some of these podcasts that have investigated past crimes, maybe injustices or unsolved crimes, and also they're in the learning space as well. Have you seen fine examples of where good work has been done by podcasts.
Yeah, well, there's a really recent example. There's actually been a case overturned in the States, a very, very famous podcast, which has been kind of like the gateway drug for a lot of people to find out about how podcasting works, called Serial. And that started out as, like a lot of other podcasts, just this little known podcast that's created by people who are interested in trying to get to the bottom of this crime. And it's actually been overturned. So the guy, he got released 2 weeks ago from jail. He's now on house arrest, subject to a retrial. Kim Kardashian's another one who's very sort of famously now going into the sort of the unlawful or turning around those sorts of judgments on people. She's launched a podcast last week called The System. So there's lots of people doing lots of good work. As Tom mentioned, because it is unregulated, you get the good and the bad. I don't think it's going to be very long before Ofcom have a look at it and go, well,
yeah.
You know, it's not a far jump of imagination that a podcast is sort of like radio, so why are we not looking after it? It's sort of through the internet, so why are we not looking after it?
But neither one of you is particularly looking forward to that day.
No, I don't look forward to it or fear it equally, but...
Tom?
I think it would be a very bad thing indeed. I mean, the good thing about podcasts is that it has destroyed those gatekeepers and it's been able to maintain it in a way that others haven't. And as soon as that goes away, I think that would be a great shame, in my view.
Blowing the bugle for free speech.